Welcome to That's Anita Live, the talk show for emotional healing through sharing. I'm Anita, your host, and here with me is Maryland Delegate Angela Angel. She's launched a movement titled Beyond October to increase consciousness and involvement around domestic violence. Angela, I read your piece in the Washington Post, and the first thing I wondered was, how did you go from law graduate to battered wife to state delegate? Like, what made you go into politics?
Well, I've actually always been in politics. I grew up in South Bend, Indiana, in a family that was very politically active. When I was at Hampton University, the dean of my...
You see that? Did you see how she slipped that into the HU?
Listen, listen.
In D.C., Hampton is always represented.
The best HU is always thoroughly in there.
Go Hampton University.
Go Hampton University. But while I was at Hampton University, my dean was Dr. Mamie Locke, and she is actually now in the Virginia Senate. But when I was there, she was running for the local county council. Okay. And so we worked on those campaigns. I then worked in the Virginia legislature, Virginia House. They're, interestingly enough, called also one of the only other legislatures that's the House of Delegates. And then I began working campaigns across the country. So I've always been politically active and been what we call a political operative. Even as an attorney, when I was doing cases, I would do different races. I've worked almost every presidential race since 2000 on either a state or a regional level. So it was just, I was working as an operative, and when the opportunity came in 2014, because 2 seats opened up where I was currently living, even though I had been through a lot and I wasn't necessarily, I think sometimes, especially we talk about as women and as Black women, we feel like we have to have everything so together, whereas men sometimes, they just wake up in the morning and shave and like, you know what, I think I look good today, I'll run for office,
Woo.
Right? Like never, not even served, not even on the usher board, but wake up and run for office. But for me, it was really a moment where I kind of really sat down and asked myself, this is going to be hard. A lot of people didn't know my situation, hadn't known what I'd been through, because I was still working, the entire time, even when we lost everything, when I lost my house, when I was in the shelter, I was in the shelter with a full-time job. It just didn't, Prince George's County is one of the highest places to live, cost of living. Yes. And so I was in a shelter, going to work every day, coming back home, trying to figure out how do I reestablish myself after my husband had left, and we were, basically half our income was cut, and none of our expenses were. So I hadn't fully, wasn't necessarily, hadn't got my life completely together, but I also knew that this was kind of a critical moment. Okay. When I look at representation, when I look at who's in the room, who's making the decisions that affect our lives, and even when I look at, as someone who has been on every side of the system, in New York I was a prosecutor, and I prosecuted child abuse and neglect. Here I was working in policy. I worked in the House of Delegates before I ever ran. I worked with the O'Malley administration, so I'd worked in the executive level of the state government. I'd worked in county council. And so I understood policy from every aspect, but I also knew there weren't a lot of people that represented, Black women, that represented single Black mothers, that represented women in general. There weren't enough women in the room. There weren't enough people who really understood how the programs and the decisions that they were making affected people on the ground. All of my children are in PGCPS schools. When we're talking about, 3 of them have IEPs or 504s. When we're talking about special education and someone comes in telling me what they do, I know what they do. When we're talking about all these other things, in different county services and what they do, as opposed to, as many of us know, what happens when you're sitting in that office. Yes. I knew there weren't enough people making the decisions and deciding what policies to push and what to fund that really had lived through this. And so for me, running was not necessarily about, Angela Angel going to the House of Delegates. It wasn't about, me becoming this elected official. It was about being that voice in the room. It was about representing, taking all of my life experiences and using them for God's glory to, as they say, to make a change, to bring help to the people. And so that was why I ran, even through all of my mess and even through, trying to figure out how to balance my kids and, and I still wasn't really paid that well, and trying to figure out all of that. But for me, that was where the passion came from then. And even now when I'm running for the Senate, people ask me all the time, well, why are you running for the Senate? You could just stay in the House. When I run for the Senate, I'll give up my delegate seat. And, and there's, it's a competitive race. If I don't win, then I'm out. And so some people say, well, why risk it? But for me, it's the same reason. The Senate is a much stronger policy-making body.
Yes.
Bills go over to the Senate and they come back completely different than they left the House. And so for me, once again, it's an opportunity to be that voice over there when someone's trying to add an amendment or change a bill. It's an opportunity to say, wait a minute, what are we doing and what does this mean for the people? That's why I ran for the House, and so that's why I made the decision to run for the Senate.
Why beyond October?
Because, and it's funny, because during the month of October, I actually do not host any domestic violence events, which, for some people, they do the same thing you said. They find it strange. They're like, wait a minute, and interestingly enough, as an aside, I actually didn't run and never really in my heart wanted to become some strong domestic violence, or as we say, DV advocate. That really wasn't. My strong policy work is in pediatric mental health. And that's what the committee I sit on is HGO. But what happened was the bill that we were trying to get out to help expand protections, it was stuck. And people didn't understand why it was so important. So I had to begin sharing my story and explaining.
Okay. Give us some background on the bill.
Sure.
Because the average viewer once you tell them what the bill was and what it stood for, they aren't going to understand why it was stuck.
Right.
And then we'll get into that.
Okay, so the bill we're talking about this year is actually House Bill 28. But previously, when I first introduced it in 2015, it was House Bill 227. And then it was House Bill, I believe, 803. And then last year, it was House Bill 1396. So this is 4 years this is the fourth year that I've introduced the language. But previously, it's been around since 2011. 2001. What the bill does is it basically expands the definition of abuse. And the reason that's important, because in the state of Maryland, you can only get a protective order for something that is defined as abuse. And right now, harassment and destruction of property is not defined as abuse. So no matter how egregious or criminal, there can be criminal level harassment where they're calling you, they're stalking you on social media, they're calling your job, they're disrupting. It's one of the things we call economic abuse, which is actually much more prevalent. Right now, when you go into court, you can present all of that evidence, and there's actually nothing a judge can do. And the same thing goes for malicious destruction of property. And that's where, they're slashing your tires. We have women that have testified they flooded the home and made them homeless. You have folks that come in and have talked about how they killed their cats or their pets. One woman talks about how her abuser slit the cat's throat in front of her. One of the actual senators testified that he had a issue in his county that he was aware of, where he lives in a more rural. This is actually a white Republican senator. And he testified during one of our bill hearings that one of his constituents had called him in because her husband had came and killed all of the horses, slit their throats. So when they came home, the children and her came home to the horses, and I believe some other maybe livestock that were dead. And everyone knew it was no doubt that the husband had did it, but the problem was that was considered a destruction of property, and so there was actually nothing to be done. So he very much, he said, I understand the need for this bill, and she couldn't even get a restraining order to bar him from coming back to the property. House. And so what this bill does is add destruction of property and harassment to the definitions of abuse. For those instances, you can present them before a judge, and you'll now be able to get protection. And so that's the difference.
Why was it stuck?
It's been stuck. There is
because listening to it.
It seems very right. It seems very common. You wouldn't believe, in my naivete, I was like, oh, I'm just going to come in here and pass this bill. I was like, Like, I remember in my particular instance when the judge, when I had presented and I was being harassed, my ex-husband was doing some pretty, calling my job, sending me text messages. And because I'm an attorney, I brought my evidence. Like, I bring receipts, as the kids say today, right? I had all of my things. And what the judge basically said to me, which always stuck in my head, he said, the law needs to change. So when I got to Annapolis, even though this wasn't my platform, this wasn't really what I was, in my head, what I was sent there to do.
Yes.
I said, well, okay, I'm gonna change this law. Like, and I went in, I met with the vice chair, and I remember her telling me, she said, well, I've been trying to do this for a while. It's very difficult. I don't think you'll be able to pass this bill. And I remember thinking, well, why? Young-ish.
Yes.
And I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's a common sense change. Basically, there's a couple of things. Any type of domestic violence bill is usually met with what is called the hysterical woman doctrine. And what that is where you will have a lot of times, and not just men, but you even have some women lawmakers that say, well, if we expand these protections, then women will just come into court for anything. And that's what they say. It's what when we talk about rape and all these other things, and that's what you'll often hear. Well, women will just come in and make false claims. So that's one of the things they say. Well, harassment is so broad, and I've even heard the chairman. If you listen to some of the bill hearings, one of the chairmen will say, well, I harass my wife all the time. I call her. I need to know what's for dinner. I need to, and making this disconnect or kind of not understanding. We're not talking about, just commonplace, you're making phone calls. We're talking about, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., disrupting someone's sleep, interfering with their job, with destruction of property. We're talking about, where you might be trying to force them to return home by ruining, their ability to get to work or even, wherever they're going to stay. Because if your friend comes to stay with you, but now their ex-husband is calling constantly or coming by the house and they can't tell them to go, there are people who will be like, you know what? I can't, I love you, I want to help you, but I can't deal with this. And then women have to return home, or they have to figure out different ways to get different options. So the reason that this has not passed is often because it's minimized. And also there are just some of the members, and not even members of the committee, but the chairman who have just had some issues with the bill. And one of the things that I presented this year, as I said, give me some language.
Yes.
One of the things that, I'm an alternative dispute resolution, counselor. That's one of my certifications from law school. Okay. I know how to negotiate. I'm like, let's figure out what language works. You don't like this? Initially they said they didn't like the criminal definition of harassment because it's too broad. So the language that I then changed and introduced is basically it lists out 3 different elements of harassment, and one of them has to be that a reasonable person would be alarmed or suffer severe emotional distress based on the actions being testified to. So the point of that is to relieve kind of this thought that, someone's just going to come in with frivolous claims. It establishes a standard that a judge has to do. So we thought maybe that language will work. And what I'm finding, I think, is there hasn't been enough of a push for them to really force the folks on the committee and the chairman to really sit down and say, okay, let's figure out language that works. And the interesting thing about Annapolis and state government is we have 90 days. I think right now we are in Friday was the 60th day. Okay. We have 60 days left. So by the time we go back on Monday, we'll be at about 56, if we count, because we count the weekends. Oh, okay. So when we get back, I'm sorry, not 56. 57, around that time. So when the 90 days are up, you're out of time. You have to start all over again next year. And so what happens is this often typically gets placed at the low end of priorities, and we just never get around to it. Or he moves it unfavorable.
Because they don't make the connection between how the civil affects the criminal.
Exactly.
And that if you take care of it at the civil level, you could cut down a whole lot of the criminal offenses.
Exactly. They also don't make the connection of how these low-level or these lower offenses escalate, and how, that's how it gets to be more physical, or how it gets to be where we have the highest rate of fatalities in Prince George's County. And, if we had been able to get some of these protective orders when some of this behavior was first happening, it could have helped stop those. And there's a disconnect with that as well. And so that's part of what we're pushing this year, and we're needing the public to help us to contact, their elected representatives and members of the committee to say, we need you to work on this language, figure out a compromise, and move the bill.
We'll be right back with more from Delegate Angela Angel.
What if I told you that you could stop the negative tape from playing inside your head? What if, with 7 simple steps, you could leave the pain of the past behind and live every day as your true, authentic self? It is possible, and you can do it. The ebook, 7 Simple Steps to Beat Emotional Baggage, How to Become Whole, Healed, Healthy, and Happy, shares how to resolve emotional baggage and feel free to live true to your own personality, spirit, and character. Transform negative thinking into positive thinking and become equipped to boldly face your past and resolve emotional pain. Get your free copy at thatanitalive.com/ebook.
And we're back with Delegate Angela Angel, and we're, at this point, going to get a little bit more into your personal story, because you have a personal DV story. Now, many women, because of church or family code, the way we're raised, don't believe in divorce. Were you one of those women?
I'm still one of those women. So yes, I don't believe in divorce. And it's interesting being divorced because a lot of my friends come to me about it, and I'm like, actually, I'm not going to advise you to leave your husband.
That's the answer I was expecting.
Right, they always
okay.
they usually be like, and I'm like,
right.
So no, I don't believe in divorce. And in large parts, my faith is a large part of who I am.
Okay.
And so I'd never wanted to be divorced. I never planned to be divorced. And I still, for me, it's something that I pray about, and I've gotten past in my own, the shame or the guilt that I feel about it. But so I don't believe in divorce. I would say that I am divorced.
Right. So how do you deal with the internal contradiction?
So interestingly enough, when we had quite a few episodes of violence, and it had gotten, pretty bad. And at one point, when we went into the shelter, and my husband, he just left, and we were, there was one particular episode where, we were in a car, and it was pretty bad. And he left, and we kind of very quickly, lost everything. And it was at that point that I still had not filed, and I was still working through in my head, but as I said, I'm a woman of faith, and I remember praying and asking God, really about where I should go and what I should do. And there's actually a point in scripture that talks about when a believer is married to an unbeliever. And the scripture actually states, and if that unbeliever leaves, you do not have to go after them. There's no requirement to go after them, nor do you have to accept them back. And honestly, when my spirit led me to that point in scripture, and I prayed over that and asked, is this where what the Spirit is showing me in that? It gave me a sense of peace about being divorced, about being separate, because my husband was he was behaving as an unbeliever. And therefore, as a believer, I'm not required to remain yoked.
But when you got married, you were in love, felt that you were loved.
Yes.
How did you get to that point?
How did I get to
the altar? Because was it that you were young, so you missed being unequally yoked and you didn't see the red flags, or?
I think we don't have enough conversations. I will tell you, most of my friends that I know that are very solidly, happily married, that they were taught how to pick a mate, how to be married, how to, they had deep conversations with their parents and with the people in their community about this is what marriage is. And I think we don't oftentimes we don't have those. And so it's just like with anything else. If you don't have a foundation, you don't understand how to build, right?
Right.
You don't know how to build this house. You don't know how to make this choice. And so I think, and that's how you find out, yes, but you're in love and this is great. And it's, and it's wonderful. And at the time, when we got married, my husband was in the Navy. And so there's this interesting, and a lot of military families will tell you this, when there's this kind of, they come home and they go away and they come home, there's always this kind of euphoria. Either you're glad they're back or you're anticipating they're leaving. And so some of the things that would have been red flags didn't really manifest until much later, and didn't really manifest until, for instance, he was out and he was home constantly, and you begin to realize, wait, this isn't necessarily just because you're leaving or because, like this is a state of that you occupy on a regular basis.
The wall of the representative is coming down. I'm getting to see the real you.
Exactly. And also seeing how you manage things. When I talk about relationships, even with my, children and with my oldest daughter, understanding, well, you have to observe, how does this person handle rejection? How do they handle being upset? How do they manage their emotions? We have to teach that. How does the person you're interacting, and how do you manage your emotions? And unless you build those, that understanding and that foundation, you can make these types of mistakes. And
now, and with the episodes between you and your husband, some of the violent episodes, his family blamed you. How did they blame you?
Well, there was a particular episode where when I was actually in his hometown, and he was arrested because I called the police. Okay. And during that time, actually, the way that it happened, they had my children. Because we were separated from where the kids were when the actual incident happened, and they actually kept my kids from me. I was calling. At one point, I didn't have anything because it was kind of unexpected. And he met me. I was out somewhere, and it was just like, well, let's go here. And at the time, you're not thinking about it. Jump in the car. I don't have my purse. I don't necessarily have. I think I have my cell phone. But I didn't think about the fact.
Right, because you feel as if you're with someone that you know, love, and trust.
Exactly. And so they had all of my stuff. And they wouldn't tell me where the kids were. They wouldn't tell me. They wouldn't bring them to me. It was, about a day and a half or so of me calling. Later on, I actually found out that through my daughters, that they had actually been trying to take them to court to get custody or to get, some type of legal documentation that would have given them custody of my children. Which is ironic because, litigation never scares me. like you want to bring something to court with me. I'm like, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. So they, and I of course knew that could not happen, but and so part of that was them running around trying to get actual custody of my children behind my back. And then, avoiding my calls and but then it was also when we finally did see each other and talk, it was just never spoken of. It was not acknowledged. It was, just.
So we're just going to pick up from this point and move forward like nothing ever happened.
Exactly.
Yeah. What clicked for you that made it clear, made the decision final that this is it and you were going to leave? Or you weren't going to take him back?
I think part of it was recognizing the trauma that was happening to my children. Recognizing, when one incident happened and, my daughter was caught in the crossfire. At one point in time, there was a point where my sons had seen something, and I remember one of my sons like calling out, like, "Mommy, Dad," and and seeing the look in his eyes, and realizing this was beginning to register, and that this wasn't about me. I had prosecuted child abuse and neglect, and domestic violence that takes place in front of children was one of the causes in New York, and it's actually a law that I'm trying to pass here, that DV in front of children can be a form of neglect. And so I knew very much the consequences that children develop seeing that, and I didn't, I never expected to raise my children in this environment. And for me, you know, your legacy, your children, what you leave them with is so critical. And I couldn't live with them thinking this is what love is, this is what relationships are. And
so how did you rebuild?
You know, prayer, God, people, community. You know, part of it is, and that's one of the things, you know, I luckily was someone that was fairly highly educated. And, you know, truth be told, like I said, I worked at the county. You know, I knew our social service systems. I didn't just know our social service systems. I knew, because having worked in New York, New Jersey, you know, having done some work in Ohio and in Indiana, I knew how these things worked. So I knew how to apply for a grant, how to get this, how to, you know, and luckily I was at a job that, for instance, if I needed to take off and go sit in somebody's office, which you oftentimes have to do, you know, I could do that. But I know a lot of people don't have those luxuries, right? I was working. So even though we lost everything and I had to figure out how to, you know, get my money back together, I did have a steady income coming in. And so when I was in the shelter, I was able to save that up and, you know, able to put money away for a home, you know, a down payment on rent, and, you know, and able to apply for grants to help supplement that. But at the same time, there was also just a lot of God's favor. And that's, you know, for me, that was how we rebuilt. But, you know, one of the reasons why I fight the way I do is I know a lot of people don't have access to those resources. A lot of people don't even have that understanding that I had to know how to navigate. You know, there are times I would go into social services and I'll admit someone would just tell me something objectively wrong, right? Like it was just wrong. And I would be like, that's not correct. I need to speak to supervisor. And even sometimes the supervisor wouldn't know. And I would be like, you need to go pull this and pull that. And, you know, and I would tell them. And then, you know, and most of the times when I was there, I did not let people know, you know, where I worked and who I was, because one, I was very private about what I was going through, but also I didn't want there to be an appearance of preference. But, you know, because I remember at one point in time, someone kind of figured out who I was, and they were like, why didn't you just, and I was like, because that wasn't, one, because your system should work properly, right? Like it shouldn't be that I have to call.
But that's an excellent way to know what your constituents have to go through should they be in that situation.
Exactly, and that's one of the reasons, you know, when I advocate for them, I do it the way, you know, so zealously, because I know what they're going through.
If you are being emotionally, mentally, or even physically abused, or if it happened to you some time ago in your past, abuse can manifest in fear, low self-esteem. It can even manifest in suicidal thoughts. Reach out for help. One thing you can do is call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Get help. Make the decision to work toward achieving a better life. Help is here for you, because I know sometimes we don't want to be fixed. We just want to be heard. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-7233. And make the commitment to start your emotional healing journey. If you'd like to reach out to Delegate Angela, reach out to
www.advocateangel.com.
One more time.
www.advocateangel.com, and on all social media, it's MD, like Maryland Advocate Angel, MD Advocate Angel.
I'm Anita, your host. Be sure to check out thatanitalive.com for where and when to see our next episode.